Tonight on Nation to Nation, universities and the arts seem to be havens for Indigenous identity fraud. One expert says it's because they don't develop relations with communities
in their area. It's a problem because non-Indigenous people are simply unqualified for the most part to figure out who is Indigenous and how they belong to community or not.
Jean Chrétien claims abuse at residential schools wasn't mentioned when he led Indian affairs. Mi'kmaq Senator Brian Francis doesn't buy it. He says it's time to call out residential school denialism.
To me, those comments are ignorant and they're offensive. Mr. Chrétien is in a position of privilege, and he would have known fully well what happened.
And as Wet'suwet'en resistance to a pipeline rises up again, one hereditary chief warns another RCMP raid may be in the works.
They know that they're setting up to come in again. You know, they've done it twice now, 2019, 2020. Armed forces invading our territory.
Hello, I'm Brett Forster, and welcome to Nation. Joseph Boyden, Michelle Latimer, Carrie Barassa. What do those names have in common? They've all claimed to be Indigenous. They've all had those claims challenged, and in the case of Barassa, suspended from her position at the University of Saskatchewan. But why do people claim to be Indigenous if they're not? And how widespread is this problem? To put this in perspective is my first guest. Dr. Kim Talbert is an Associate Professor of Native Studies at the University of Alberta. She joins me now. Welcome to Nation, Dr. Talbert.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. So what do you think motivates people to identify as Indigenous when they have little or no connection to the nations they claim?
I think there's probably a couple of reasons, and they probably overlap. I think the first one, speaking very broadly, is there is this special place for the Indian in the kind of North American national imagination. So the Indian takes on this important role historically. So people, if you go back several hundred years, you've got, you know, the Boston Tea Party, you've got people dressing up like they're Indian in fraternal orders. You have this playing Indian for a long time in terms of dressing up and putting on costumes. What happens then as you get into the 20th century is you get people playing Indian in terms of cultural appropriation in the New Age movement. And then you get this eruption of the race shifter or the pretendian, to use a couple of different terms. But I think even though it looks like not that old of a phenomenon, it actually has roots going back several hundred years, which is about needing to belong to this place and needing to feel that one has a moral authority to belong to and possess this land. So I think there's this kind of nationalistic ideas behind this, but also on a much more pragmatic level, there are economic and career benefits and media benefits and leadership benefits to claiming these kinds of identities. So I think there's both kind of on the ground reasons and then these kind of loftier ideals behind all of this.
Now, as you mentioned there, it's not really a new phenomenon. You can think back to Grey Owl, kind of one of the original race shifters, I guess you could say. So is this becoming more common, or are pretenders just being called out more often? What do you think?
Perhaps over the last 20 to 30 years, it's become more common. And I also do think they're being called out more. I think other commentators have pointed to the fact that in Canada, for example, truth and reconciliation and the desire by institutions to enter into what they consider reconciliation has played a part in this. There are suddenly, you know, I think many more grants and benefits to identifying as Indigenous or other kinds of racial and ethnic categories. But I also do think there has been a greater willingness to call this out of late. I mean, I've been aware at my age that this has been a problem since the 1980s. This is when it, I think, comes into our consciousness more. And, you know, there's plenty of jokes out there, right, in Indigenous communities about claiming a great-great-grandmother that was this or that thing that had high cheekbones, you know, so I feel Native or Indigenous in my soul. I must be Indigenous. So we make fun of that, and we have for decades. But it was always a little bit very uncomfortable to call people out like this, because I think a lot of Indigenous people in community tend to have sympathy for people, and especially with the idea that there are a lot of folks out there who want to reconnect, who were scooped or stolen, right? And these two situations tend to get confused in people's mind. I don't think these are anywhere near the same situation.
Mm-hmm. On that same note, how does this impact people who may be disconnected from their communities for legitimate reasons?
I think that people are because people who have been disconnected, who have been scooped, or who have suffered the ramifications of federal Indian policy, right, that doesn't allow them status, do get very insecure. They experience, I think, a lot of sadness from that disconnection, right? Not everybody, but a lot of people. And I do think it's hard for them because they didn't grow up in community, be that reserve or urban. I don't put a binary between those things like a lot of people do. A lot of us go back and forth, right, between different kinds of Indigenous community because we have family all over the place. But I think people who didn't grow up in that life don't understand fully how they are not generally put into the same kind of category as people who are alleging ancestry. We don't even know if it's true. And if they do have it, it's multiple generations away. As we saw in the case of Michelle Latimer, when was it? Back to the 1640s, she had a couple of ancestors. That is not the same thing to go back 17 generations as being a person who has been disconnected through federal Indian policy or other phenomena of colonialism in the last couple of generations.
And what are some of the arguments people accused of falsely claiming to be Indigenous often make to defend against the charge?
Well, they will actually conflate their situation with the situation of the scoop and disconnected. So it's actually quite cynical and self-serving. And again, if one is from one of those scoop populations and doesn't have that kind of closeness with community, it's not as easy, I think, to disentangle your own story from the story of people who are, let's be frank, committing fraud, right? So that's one of the main things they do. They'll also talk about violence, right? And being disconnected through violence and have this kind of overblown story of violence in Indigenous communities. And sure, we have and continue to be subject to colonial violence. But when you grow up in Indigenous community, you also know the profoundly meaningful and loving and caring experiences that you can have, right? You know, we tell stories about our grandparents, about our aunties and uncles. We talk about the kind of community we have. And in any community, you have really life-affirming dynamics, and you might also have violent dynamics. Of course, Indigenous people suffer a particular kind of colonial violence. But I find in the case of people who are making exaggerated or false claims that they tend to overly focus on that violence as a source of disconnection, and then that becomes their dominant narrative. Indigeneity gets conflated with violence, or it gets conflated with this kind of spiritual redemption. There's hardly ever any real kind of on-the-ground everyday life dynamics that they talk about that we can take a lot of enjoyment in coming from Indigenous community.
When these accusations come forward, people often say that they were adopted by a community, which gives them a legitimate claim to being an Indigenous member of that community. How do you respond to that particular argument?
Well, I can, I speak mostly from a Dakota standpoint, right? But as I hear people up here, because I came to Canada from the US, as I hear people up here on the prairies, I'm a prairie person, talk about adoption ceremonies, it sounds similar to ours. And when you adopt somebody ceremonially, you are making a family member, you are making a kin member, but you are not making a citizen. You are not making a band member. And I think what we need to keep clear, both in Indigenous communities and in non-Indigenous communities, is that our political authorities and our citizenship, they may be in part a manifestation of our traditional forms of governance, but they're also in part a manifestation of our nation-to-nation relationships with colonial powers, including the Canadian state or the US state, right? And so we have to keep clear that citizenship and a band membership, or whatever you want to call it, is different than making a family member, than making kin, and those things can overlap. And I think a lot of Indigenous people don't understand that. I can go into ceremony and adopt somebody as my sister or my brother. It doesn't make them a Dakota person. I mean, I have family that are not biological family that are not Dakota people, right? I've got a white aunt, I've got a family that are, in other racial categories. I've got Black family, right? Some of them are Dakota, some aren't. So going through a ceremony doesn't make you a member of that group necessarily, but it can make you family.
Just finally, academia and the arts seem to be the places where this phenomenon happens most. What could or should the gatekeepers of those institutions do to clamp down?
We're really struggling, right? And I think what we need to do is look to our senior people in those fields who actually come from Indigenous community to figure out how to balance Indigenous rules about citizenship, about kinship, and about family with the practical kinds of challenges within these institutions. So how do you vet an Indigenous hire or student in the university? We need to understand how these institutions work in order to do that. And one of the first ways to do that, I think, is to have really good relationships with local and regional Indigenous communities and to consult them as well. Now, I know this is putting work back on Indigenous people, right? It's putting extra work onto Indigenous people in the academy and also out in community. But those relationships are a key starting point. If an institution has no relations with the Indigenous communities in their area, it's a problem because non-Indigenous people are simply unqualified for the most part to figure out who is Indigenous and how they belong to community or not.
Okay, Dr. Kim Tallbear, that's all the time we have for now. I want to thank you for coming on Nation to Nation.
Thanks for having me on.
After the break, Mi'kmaq Senator Brian Francis will be here. He'll discuss the progress on reconciliation, among other things. Stick around. Senator Brian Francis helped create the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation when it was fast-tracked through the Senate in June. Since then, from Trudeau's Tofino trip to Chrétien's comments about residential schools and now a proposed papal visit to Canada, the path of reconciliation has been a bit bumpy. Senator Francis is Mi'kmaq from Abiguit, also known as Prince Edward Island, and he joins me from there to offer his reflections. Welcome to Nation, Senator Francis.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with recent news. What would you like to see Pope Francis do when and if he arrives in Canada?
Well, I think, the fact that he is going to apologize is certainly a step forward in the right direction. It saddens me that it took so long for him to actually say that he was coming to Canada to apologize. But I think now that he is, it's time for us to work together in true spirit of meaningful reconciliation and have the Catholic Church atone in the way that it should atone for what it has done to our Indigenous children through the residential school era.
Will an apology be enough if that does happen on Canadian soil, or should he come bringing reparations or maybe something else?
Well, absolutely. Apology is just words if it's not followed by meaningful action. So reparation is key to it. It all starts from the top down, in my opinion, right down to the congregation. I'm a practicing Catholic, and in my church, I haven't heard very much spoken about the residential school era and atoning for what has happened to our children. And I think now's the time that it has to happen, and it has to happen from the top down in a meaningful way.
Last week, former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien told Radio Canada that abuse at residential schools was never mentioned when he led Indian Affairs between 1969 and 1974. What was your reaction to those comments?
Well, first of all, I was hurt as an Indigenous person because to me those comments are ignorant and they're offensive. Mr. Chrétien is in a position of privilege, and he would have known fully well what happened in the residential school era during that time. And I think it leads to a broader issue of genocide denialism, where some people, whether they be in positions of power or not, deny or underscore what really happened in the residential school era. And all they really have to do is go to our First Nations communities, to anyone in Canada, and see the awful effects of the residential school era and see that intergenerational trauma is alive and well, and so on. So for those comments to be made, I think they're just, they're ignorant.
His government did actually apologize for residential schools in 1998, but even then it was considered to be not exactly full-throated. He administered a lot of other harmful policies, so how are Indigenous people supposed to reconcile with that sort of thing?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's important for all of us to, to counter what's been said by whoever. And it's important for all of us as Canadians to get the full story, to understand what really happened. I mean, the facts are there when it comes to Jean Chrétien. that he should have known. The facts are there. And I think it's important for us to confront as Canadians these types of comments, and because they have no place in our country, and it's now time to deal with them.
You sponsored Bill C-5, which created the new federal holiday for reconciliation when it reached the Senate in the spring. What was your reaction when the Prime Minister skipped out on the first one?
Well, life is about choices, right? And it wasn't a very good choice for the Prime Minister to make. We all know that it was a day of solemn thought, thinking about the residential school survivors, almost like a remembrance day, a day of reflection. It wasn't a day to go to a golf course or to a resort, in my opinion. I think it was just a poor choice. We're all human, and, that happens.
Mm-hmm. You spoke out when Mi'kmaq lobster harvesters were under attack last year for exercising their treaty rights. What should the government do on that file moving forward?
Well, I think, the government should revisit that file immediately. There's now a new minister. I'm hopeful that the new minister will take a different approach than the previous minister. And it's about acknowledging our rights and implementing our rights in the way that they should be done. We had the Supreme Court decision that was rendered years ago that wasn't implemented properly, in my opinion. We have to get on with it and do it in the right way, or there'll be further violence on the water if it's not done the right way.
And just finally, as I mentioned in my introduction, it has been a bit of a bumpy road on the path of reconciliation this last little while. What's your take on how the country has fared?
I think we're starting to make a turn in terms of reconciliation. I always say it's a marathon, not a sprint. There are going to be bumps in the road. There's going to have to be some difficult conversations, but we all have to be brave. We all have to really look at this in a true and meaningful way and move forward with concrete actions. Words are one thing, but we have to move forward with concrete actions in terms of, having our Indigenous people have their rightful place in Canada with all Canadians.
Okay, Senator Brian Francis, we'll have to leave it there for now. I want to thank you for joining me on Nation to Nation.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
We have to take a short break, but when we return, I'll be joined by Wet'suwet'en Hereditary Chief Namox for an update on the Coastal Gaslink pipeline standoff. Welcome back. Almost 2 years ago, an RCMP raid on Wet'suwet'en territory sparked nationwide protests in solidarity with hereditary chiefs who opposed the Coastal GasLink pipeline. The pipeline would carry fracked gas through their unceded land to a processing facility on the British Columbia coast, and the chiefs still oppose it. They mounted new blockades last month, which the Mounties responded to with more arrests. My next guest is Namox John Ridsdale. He is the hereditary chief of the Wet'suwet'en Sayu, or Beaver Clan. Welcome to Nation.
Thank you for calling me.
Protests subsided last year after the Chiefs, Canada and BC signed an MOU on land rights and title. How much progress has been made?
Actually, with the pandemic that has happened worldwide, it has actually slowed down quite a bit. But I put it as strategy too, because I think that was their intent. You have to realize we talked about it in February, and then we did sign off in May of 2020. But the progress on it, we had to separate our rights and title from the Coastal GasLink project itself, because they were going to focus on that project, which we adamantly oppose, because it is our jurisdiction. We have rights and title. From Delgamuukw court case of 1997, we've never ever given that up. But we had to separate our rights and title from that so we could stay focused. And yet that project itself continued.
Mm-hmm. And so what led to this latest round of direct action and new blockade?
And our premier, John Horgan, he supports this project. You got to remember, Prime Minister Trudeau bought a pipeline, right? So we know exactly where they come from. But there were so many infractions on their permitting process, the access. We've never ever supported this at all. We gave them an eviction. And so when our people stand up along with our supporters to support our chiefs, our decision, our law is Anak Nuoten, our own law, our own way, which is protection of the land, the waters, the salmon, all of our territories the 22,000 square kilometers. And so they pushed an extra step. And you have to realize it was Coastal Gaslink who had actually put in their own blockade, and the RCMP come in later and supported it. We know that they're setting up to come in again. You know, they've done it twice now, 2019, 2020. Armed forces invading our territory. Like, I thought we lived in a democratic country, and yet we have armed forces. Myself, being a son of a Second World War veteran, served in the Navy in the Pacific and Atlantic theaters, and yet here I am fighting our own government over what? Something that will kill our clean waters and our lands and threatens our rights and title, which we will never give up. We will never stop protecting our territories and our culture.
I understand that 5 of 6 elected chiefs of the Wet'suwet'en bands did sign agreements to support this project. What progress has been made mending internal disputes?
The internal issues are actually brought on by government. And you have to realize we're elected. We're not elected, we're hereditary. Like, when elected officials, chiefs, and council, they have a mandate to look after the reserve, not the territory. Yes, they are House and Clan members. That's where their voice is. But as elected officials, which is, you know, it was created by the Canadian government, the reserve system. And so their voice is heard as House and Clan members. But the government and industry will always take the path of least resistance. They keep our reserves in poverty, and so they offer them these shiny little nickels to enhance their projects. Meanwhile, the need on the reserve is always there for more compensation for what has been taken away. And yet the voice and the authority lies with us, within the House, the Clan, not within any form of elected government.
As a rule, and you kind of hinted at this earlier, the feds generally don't negotiate while blockades are up. Are you concerned that ongoing resistance to the pipeline may endanger the talks?
Actually, they won't. That's why they are separate. We strategically made sure it was separate, because they would have focused strictly on resource development and enhancement of such projects as this. And so it had to be strategically separate, and yet they keep on steering it back to, you know, their full support of an industry which is willing to kill our culture, our land, our water, our salmon. That's why we as chiefs decided, no, we steer this discussion. You have to realize, before this, we had a table with BC. It was called the Rankin table, and they walked away from us. We referred to it as WGUS, respect table. They walked away. And so this was their next step. But we will never, ever sign a treaty.
Okay, one more question. The Mounties put out a press release last week saying they will be, quote-unquote, proactively patrolling the forestry roads on your territory from now on. What do you make of that, and what happens next?
They've been doing that for the last number of years, and it's all in support of this industry, this proposed project. We say proposed because we've never, ever supported it, and we never will. But they have always been doing that harassment that they've done to our people and our supporters. That will continue, and that's under the direction of the provincial and federal governments. I think the public should know that.
Okay, Chief Namox, that's all the time we have for tonight. I want to thank you for coming on Nation to Nation.
Thank you for inviting me.
And that's all the time we have for this episode. As always, if you missed any part of tonight's show, you can find us online. Go to aptnnews.ca/Nation to Nation. I'm Brett Forster, and thanks for watching.